Hello, everybody. Buenas tardes. Welcome to our session. I am very, very excited to be here today with you all. We're just going to get started here with our presentation. My colleague Jerome and I are here. And yeah, let's get started. Let's see. Perfect. So as we move into our first slide here, here's just a very nice image of Jerome and I for today's conversation. Hi, saludos a todos. My name is Mónica Nadal. I am the Art and Talent Director here at Pollen Midwest. I use she, her pronouns. And for today's conversation, I will be focusing my conversation around art direction, and also how to hire freelancers and how to go about it. So that's just a little bit of how the conversation is going to go from my end, and I'll pass it off to my colleague Jerome.
Hi folks, I'm Jerome Rankine. I'm the Editorial Director at Pollen. I use he, him pronouns. And today I'm going to be sharing some guidance and ways that you can shape effective and courageous writing in the narratives you're working on. We'll have examples that you can learn from, both from Pollen and other organizations, and then some strategies that you can take with you.
Awesome. Thank you, Jerome. So before we get started, I wanted to make sure that we would ground ourselves in today's conversation. I know that there are quite a few Pollenites here in the room that have attended past Pollen events, but for those of you whose this is your first time getting introduced to Pollen, welcome. You are all Pollenites here today in this space. But I just wanted to give you a little bit of a quick background about Pollen and who we are. So we are a media arts organization that fosters empathy, encourages connection across difference, and inspires meaningful action by sharing stories of individuals who want to change our collective story for the better. And then our Pollen Studio side, which we will be showing a few examples of our work, is our social enterprise. This allows us to partner with mission-driven organizations. We are explorers in creating a more just and vibrant future through social impact storytelling, engagement, and design. And now going into the presentation itself, I will hand it off to my colleague Jerome to start us off with the stories we tell.
Thanks, Moni. So the next slide here will have us dive in earnest. Think about imagination through change. So moments of change are opportunities for reflection on the past, present, and future. So we are in the midst of such a moment. It's felt like a long midst, but we're still in it. The past year has been full of change at all kinds of levels. We felt them personally, locally, in our neighborhoods, regionally, nationally. Julie named this at the opening session this morning. COVID hit, George Floyd was murdered, and we are still processing and navigating just the ripples of impact from both of those events. Not to mention political upheaval, changing economic realities. It's a lot. Case in point, we are hosting the 2020 edition of Navigating Through Change here in February of 2021. It's very real that what we're all going through. So the question is, how can we and the organizations that we represent respond to this kind of change? And the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about what we think the path forward could be. So there's two choices here. We can stay the course, or we can imagine new paths forward. And in times of upheaval, there are great arguments for both of these options. There's an argument for stability, for being an unchanging, reliable voice amid times of change. And there's an argument for the comfort and the consistency that can provide. But Mónica and I are not here to make that argument. The case that we're making is the case for imagination, for having the courage to change course in response to the times, and to make sure that our language, our messages, and our approaches are a good fit for the current moment. And we say all of this with complete and full knowledge of what's at stake. Money is tight. Many organizations are feeling pressure, feeling risk averse. Some organizations haven't survived this kind of transition. But I think risk averse communications are in and of themselves a huge risk in these times. Over the past year, we've seen some really prominent organizations get called out for sort of risk averse decision making and messaging. And I think that's because there's a point where consistency of message slides into tone deafness. And we don't want that. So we're going to share next an example of how Pollen made an adjustment to this new reality. The coronavirus crisis hit nonprofits like an earthquake, and we're still feeling those tremors. It's a great example of a landscape altering event, bringing us back to the original question. In moments of crisis, we can stay the course or imagine new paths forward. You know where we stand on that question. Now we're a year or more into the after times, and we're seeing some patterns in what communities and audiences are looking for from organizations when they communicate. And here's what we think we've learned on the next slide. It's time for real talk. In moments of crisis, people look for clarity, and our communications can offer that. If you've got something worth saying, it's worth saying it clearly and powerfully. These were good practices in the before times, and now I think they're borderline essential. And in this moment, it allows organizations to make a very justifiable pivot in the way you communicate. So you take a look at the list. On one side of the continuum, the things that are sort of the status quo, and on the other side is what we think organizations should push toward. So walk away from jargon, move toward more direct language. Fewer vague statements, more real talk, less of an institutional voice and more of a human voice. So the things on the left side of the list can feel very comfortable, mostly for the organizations doing the communicating. But we're posing that now is not a time for comfort, it's a time for challenge. So Pollen had to adjust to the realities of COVID, as we hope everyone else had to adjust. And there's a key point about the adjustments we're talking about. They may represent a new direction in messaging, in communications, in approach, in communication strategy, but they don't have to represent a change in values. That's where the consistency comes in. They're sort of the bedrock that will kind of guide the choices that you make, even if the choices are different. For example, Are You Okay? So this is a series of stories and art that Pollen curated as the COVID crisis entered its first big wave. We had a firm plan walking into 2020, but by February and March, it was pretty clear that we needed to leave that plan behind and our community needed something different. We don't think of that as reactionary. We think of it as being in tune with our network and listening and being responsive to what we heard. Pollen's not the perfect example of the change we're talking about. We're still working on it, but this is really an example of a thought process that we use to lead into that work. So on the next slide, Pollen's been around for over a decade. In that time, we've shied away from first-person storytelling, kind of as a matter of policy. We've done reported feature stories, mostly. But in response to this moment, we realized that what people wanted as our connections to each other were tested by the virus, by quarantine, by working remotely, that what people wanted was to hear from each other. So we moved away from our policy of not doing first-person storytelling, and we made the series almost fully in that vein. We wanted people to be able to hear directly from the voices of others experiencing the turbulence with us. There's a risk in that. People expected a certain voice from Pollen, and we moved in a very different direction. But the next slide will dig in and remind us what held things together. Human connection. It sustains our ability to create, work, and push for solving some of the biggest challenges we all face, and now is no different. So this slide is really the introductory slide and the introductory language and images that we used for Are You Okay? And values are the through lines. So human connection has been a value of Pollen since the very beginning. And we made that connection from then to now, even as we were changing our communications mode, we made that connection explicit. We didn't change our values. We just changed how those values manifested themselves in our work, in keeping with the changes in our world. So Pollen also had a bunch of live gatherings on our calendar in early 2020 that we had to adjust when it became impossible to do those gatherings in person. The pivot in format is another topic for another time. But what changed outside the format wasn't so much the messaging, but the frequency in response to what we felt was needed. So we had events, every week for a number of weeks, allowing people to share their experiences with COVID-19, how they were building a community of care within them, even though we were kept apart by social distancing. And the thing about this was, when we felt this format wasn't needed, we just stopped. We didn't feel beholden to the series. We never put a time frame on how long we do it. It was just kind of jazz. We allowed that creativity and that imagination to both lead us into the series, and then when we felt we were done, we pulled away. That kind of strategy can feel risky, can feel untethered, but again, as long as the values behind your message and the strategy are consistent, you can't get lost. So I'll pass it over to Moni to talk about impact.
Thank you, Jerome. Yeah, thank you for walking us through too as well, just how this campaign came together. I'm seeing here just the numbers and trying to put myself back in last year in this moment when we were just trying to figure out the pandemic, you know? We left the office at the beginning of March just thinking that it was going to be a few weeks and then we were going to gather back, and just noticing that weeks kept every day was something different. But what really tied us together was the understanding that our pollenites really wanted to see something from pollen, just to bring people together in a safe way virtually, and at the same time produce the work that we do, that storytelling, that design work, in a way that just allows people to see themselves in it, and at the same time hear other people's stories in that work, just learn about how everybody is doing. And that's how Are You Okay came about. So the campaign numbers that I have here to show you, of course, in communications, making sure like what we're doing, the output that we're providing, are people really engaging? Are people really seeing this? So between March through April of 2020, we brought here the campaign numbers. 11 stories were published. Within those stories, we had beautiful writing, beautiful illustration work, design work that really helped bring these stories to life. We hired and paid 41 freelancers locally, ranging from all different types of talents and backgrounds, new artists, also artists that we had worked with in the past. And just knowing that as the pandemic kept, you know, showing up and presenting itself, a lot of artists were losing jobs left and right. And so we wanted to make sure that we would bring artists into this work and pay them for that work, which is something that I will put a star in and repeat again at the end of our presentation. We hosted 7 virtual events and had 1,275 virtual attendees. And in our next slide, I'll just want to highlight the fact that in less than 2 months, we published 11 powerful personal stories, reaching more than 20,000 readers on our website and hitting over 85,000 social media impressions. And that continues to unveil till this day, right? These were those initial impressions that we saw at the beginning. And I'll say with all of this work, it was all hands on deck from our team. We kind of took a pause, as Jerome had mentioned, in the work, and decided to kind of really focus our efforts on this. And it was day in and day out as far as like what we are putting together, from the commissions of artwork. But we also understood as a team that we needed to also find rest. So with a lot of this work, we also understand at Pollen that our culture is super important. So after we produced this work, we took a long pause break as a team collectively to help us ground ourselves and understand that we are still going through this pandemic. Because of course we did it with community in mind, but we also needed a time to rest. And I hope that from not only these examples of numbers and showcasing what we put together, but also understanding as a collective, as a team, it's important that we all take a moment, a breather, to really just collect ourselves, and find that moment of rest and continue to heal. I'll also do a special highlight here that these stories are primarily by Black, Indigenous, people of color, BIPOC, and femme, non-binary, and transgender. Writers like Michael Kleber Diggs, Kaukalia Yang, Sarah White, just to name a few, were just all a part of this collective. And I get this question a lot at Pollen of, how can I find their work? How can I get connected to them? In our website, we do have a contributors page. If you're curious after our presentation, check out our contributors page. It has a full list of different artists that we have worked with. And always whenever we publish a story at Pollen, we make sure to list the contributors who form a part of that so you can get to know them more, give them a follow on social media, check out their websites. And if you want to partner with them for your own organization, feel free to reach out. So just keep that in mind as far as who form part of our collective for the Are You Okay and for our other work at Pollen. So now that we have walked you through our Are You Okay campaign, we're going to do a little breakout session of 15 minutes. So our colleague Tom is going to break you up in groups, and you are going to be discussing within your group ways that your own organization could or already has changed its messaging and tone over the past few months, over the past year almost, because it'll be almost a year here in March. And the question to ask yourself is, how has that been received, or what impact do you anticipate coming from that change of narrative, from that change of approach? So as I mentioned, we will be taking 15 minutes, and we'll include this question in our breakout rooms so that way you can converse amongst yourselves with your team. and we'll come back and talk to our next chapter, which is showing a few examples of our work. Welcome back, everybody. Bienvenidos to the session, to our part 2. I see that I have been spotlighted here. I hope everybody had a good session. I love my group. I love when we go into these virtual rooms, more virtual than the virtual session itself, and get transported back into this moment. But yeah, I hope everybody had a good conversation with your team and had some good takeaways. For me and my team, we just went around asking ourselves, what is one word that we use to describe 2020? And my word was adaptability. And my team had some great words to share as well. So would love for everyone to have one piece of takeaway of what is that word to describe 2020, the year 2020. But now I am going to move us into our part 2, which are examples and strategies that we have taken from that Are You OK campaign and Pollen as a whole, and then applied it into our Pollen Studio work. As we mentioned, that social enterprise component to Pollen, where we have partnered with mission-driven organizations. And I'll hand it off to my colleague Jerome to start us off with the first project that we want to share with you, and we'll go from there.
All right. So both of these examples are going to be case studies of Pollen Studio work that kind of use the principles that we talked about in part 1 of the kinds of communication that we are moving our clients toward and partners toward, and the kind of same strategies that that you can adopt on your own as well. What I think I want to do in future presentations is just take the great examples that happen in every single breakout room that I'm in and just have people give their own case studies, because there was some amazing stuff in my breakout session too. But instead, we'll talk about water main. So water main is a project in partnership with Minnesota Public Radio, tasked with rethinking the narrative around water conservation. The research team there created a really dense report about the messages that were and weren't working, and the ways that people connect and understand and don't connect and don't understand water in their everyday lives. It was full of really wonky stuff, as you can imagine. And so they hired Pollen Studio to help translate this and make it into something more approachable and digestible. It was really tough for them to break free of the standard ways that they used to talk about water, because old habits are hard to break. The things that used to work don't work as well anymore in this sort of new reality we're in. And for water main, it raised questions about how well storytelling around water conservation was ever working. So they were ready for to revisit, but also had to go through the growing pains of what that change meant. So jumping to the next slide, we'll get an example of what this looked like in practice. So again, it was difficult for them to make the change, but they pushed through that, and with some guidance, they ended up with something that does a lot of the stuff we talked about. So we'll take a look at these two examples here. On the left side is the original language that introduced the survey, the research results. And I'll read it through so you can really get a sense of sort of what this language felt like. And then we'll take a look at the one on the right side. So here's what the original language was to introduce the survey, the research results. This survey provides the first ever baseline measurement of these concepts among the American public. The American public's general knowledge about water-related issues varies greatly from topic to topic. Virtually all American adults indicate some sort of connection to water. American adults indicate a fair amount of concern over water-related issues, both in terms of immediate concerns like affordability and drinking water safety, to worries about the future of the nation's water resources. Overall, the survey results show that Americans have relatively high connection with and concern for water, but relatively low overall knowledge and variable levels of action. So there's a lot of good information in there, but it isn't exactly what I would call approachable or direct human voice language. So we try to work on that. And on the right side of the screen, you'll see what Pollen created as sort of the introductory language for this body of work. And here it is. Everybody cares about water. This wasn't always true. For decades, the water community worked to educate people on water issues. We won a different victory from the one we expected. Most people in this country still don't have a firm grasp on where their tap water comes from, how to protect it, or how we pay for it. But thanks to the consistent efforts of water champions, people now care about and connect to water. So you can see the differences there. The language is more direct. There are shorter, more declarative sentences. It has that honest and human voice that comes from that kind of construction. And it's a credit to Watermain and their team that they were open to the idea of a real hard pivot away from the way they used to talk about their work to the way that we thought it made sense for them to talk about it going forward. And that imagination in the copy also needed to be mirrored in design. And Moni is going to talk a little bit about how that worked.
Thank you, Jerome. So everybody cares about water was definitely a driving force behind the design, behind the imagination of what we were going to put together. So Watermain had requested to take all of this data, the copy, the information, and distill it and turn it into a printed publication, which I will show momentarily. And in addition to that, we were also talking about how are we going to reach audiences, not just through the printed piece. So we also developed a digital campaign. So if you go today to Watermain website, you'll be able to see this campaign about water and us. And so as we started looking at the language coming together, because at Pollen, we are experts in narrative storytelling, we look at the copy, and then from there, I started thinking like, we can definitely go the photography route and commission just different moments, because this was actually commissioned before the pandemic, but it was also in the process too. But we took the illustration route because with illustration, you're able to really imagine that world that words are helping us see. And so I wanted to create a hero illustration. This is Pollen Studio language that we use to call an image that holds a world of possibilities within it. So in this hero illustration that I am showing you, there are different moments, like different moments throughout this piece that can be carved out and really blown up and help explain what Watermain is trying to convey. Whether if it's, someone canoeing at the boundary waters, or it is someone taking their car for a wash, or a parent walking down the street with their child and they're jumping into a puddle. Everybody cares and connects with waters in various ways. And this is how this hero illustration came about. Now, it is one thing to commission an illustration and just let it be a piece of a PNG file, but when we commission work at Pollen, we want to make sure that this work can live in various ways. So not only did it form part of the printed piece, which I can give you a little highlight here, we developed this beautiful booklet that talks about water and us, and then you open it up and it has that language that Jerome just read to us. And that hero illustration, which is actually illustrated by Stella Williams, a local illustrator who helped bring this world to life. And then as we look at the pages in here in the photos, this is all data and copy that helps tell the story of how we need to know about water, we need to connect, we need to act, and also have our concerns be heard about how are we connecting with water. And so this printed piece, as I mentioned, turned out to be a mailer. So Watermain mailed this out to, I believe, 2,000 of their supporters. And then all of these elements, we're also working with an iconographer, Betta DeFlorian, another local illustrator, who helped put these icons that drive the data points of what Watermain had put together. And in the next slide, we'll see all of those different elements just really carved out into meaningful messaging for this campaign. So again, this image just helps convey how all that language that Jerome read, and in addition to the data points that Watermain pulled together, and then just really carry it through from beginning to end. And so that hero illustration that I showed you at the beginning also wrapped around the booklet. So we see it from the opening to then the back as well, with call to action points of how to get connected with the Watermain. So telling this story not only through the copy, but also through design are things that we hold at Pollen. And in our next slide, I wanted to show you that digital piece. So also at Pollen, when we create then these hero illustration commissions or the printed piece, we also think about the digital campaign. A lot of people, as we know, connect not only through email, but also through social media. So these are some sample of the Twitter. Oh my God, I can't say Twitter. please quote me on that one. But Twitter cards that we did for the campaign. So we had these also live on Instagram, but starting with Americans don't have deep knowledge of water issues. And then we pulled together what actions are American adults taking to conserve water, followed by we must direct people's good intentions to solutions. And finally, just really bringing it all together, that water holds a special place in our lives. So these are just a few snippets of how our social campaign really helped live not only the moment that people receive that mailer, but also how it still lives throughout their social media till today, and they can repurpose it in various ways. Again, everything feeling connected and cohesive with that copy, with that illustration, all based on imagining a world where we are all connected in water, which we live in on a day-to-day, but it translated into this illustration. So moving us from water main, we are going to now bring you to our next study, which is the Cerno Foundation.
Thank you. So the Cerno Foundation is a national organization that's focused on social change. They have a program called the Thriving Cultures Program that works to inject funds into creative communities, helping to jumpstart new ideas on dismantling systems of racial injustice. Like water main, their information is complex, but the complexity here is in their theory of change. And in explaining that theory of change, they were used to foundation language. So jargon just isn't sciencey. It's not just science that has jargon. As I'm sure you know, nonprofits and mission-driven organizations have a language all of their own. Cerno wanted to offer a new way of looking at their work internally and telling the story of their work externally. So what they had in mind was an explainer video. These aren't new. They exist all over YouTube. If you want to find an organization, you just Google them. I'm sure they have an explainer video that talks about their theory of change. But Cerno wanted this to feel unique. So Pollen brought a narrative approach to share their theory of change, and they didn't want the script to feel like a dry PDF or a bullet list of priorities and strategies. So we had some work to do. On the next slide, you'll take a look and see the work that we did. Cerno was excited about this idea, but they didn't really have the capacity or the expertise on staff to rework their messages, and we helped to create a more human script. Now, I'm going to read this super fast, but I really do, I know I'm being cognizant of time, but I want to read this so you can hear how different these two passages sound to your ears and not just to your eyes. But take a look at the original language that Cerno used to talk about one key pillar of their theory of change, and then how we translated that for the script in the explainer video. So here's the original. Arts have a history of successfully speaking to our hearts and minds by shining a light on injustice and by articulating alternatives that can make communities more sustainable. To achieve robust distribution across diverse networks of creative leaders, Thriving Cultures will provide direct support to individuals, unincorporated collectives, nonprofit organizations, and businesses, and will partner with a variety of regranters, both organizations and pool funds, in addition to supporting our distribution of resources across broad networks and key niche communities, e.g. youth. These regranters will also provide direct support and technical assistance to practitioners on the ground. That's a mouthful. And if you're doing a 1 minute and 30-second video, you really can't squeeze all that in to explain just 1/3 of what you do. We truncated that quite a bit, decided what information was important and what information wasn't for this level of communication, and reshaped that into this. Racial justice harms communities each and every day. Whether it's a fresh look at an old problem, a radical approach to disrupt the comfortable, or a subtle shift that gets big results, our communities have no shortage of grand ideas that will help create change. The Thriving Cultures program funds the collaboration and imagination necessary to build a more racially just world. So, as before, we changed that language to be more direct, more honest, more human, and we did an entire script with sort of natural and de-jargoned language. And then we needed some art to mesh with that new language.
Yes, thank you, Jerome. So with that new language, similar approach with the water main, we take a look at what is being pulled together, sometimes at the same time, other times just getting an understanding of where the editorial copy is at. And then with the design, we just really want to understand what our partners are wanting to achieve. In this case, Cerno is thinking about radical imagination for racial justice. And when we think about imagination, it can definitely go into a world of it's not possible to attain. But we know, for example, with Cerna's work, this is all attainable work, and they're actually already doing it. So in the upcoming slide, we're actually going to give you a sneak peek at the work that we put together with the Cerno Foundation of creating this animation video. It is a 2-minute video that walks us through imagination of really understanding that we need to invest in artist-led strategies that help build just communities in the United States. Again, this is pertaining to Cerno's work, but it was really that anchor point that then brought us from the imagination to the reality, to the fact that Cerno is actually right now funding the work with one of their grantees. So without further ado, and as Jamie mentioned, we haven't shared this publicly yet, but I'm very excited to show you all this animation video.
Within each of us is a spark of imagination that can be a light in dark times, or a beacon for others to follow. Finding solutions to issues of racial injustice requires that kind of light. Not just will, but radical imagination. Our creative communities, artists, designers, culture bearers, and creators are the imagination engines that will drive new approaches to addressing structural and systemic racism. Cerno Foundation's Thriving Cultures program works to fuel that engine. Racial injustice harms communities each and every day. The Thriving Cultures program funds the collaboration and imagination necessary to build a more racially just world. Whether it's a fresh look at an old problem, a radical approach to disrupt the comfortable, or a subtle shift that gets big results, our communities have no shortage of grand ideas that will help create change. Dreams that leave behind the status quo, and with the right care and nurturing, will create a more equitable future. And a vision gets even stronger when others can see it. Thriving Cultures works to clarify these ideas to make that possible. By investing in community efforts to gather data and share what's working, we turn the creative into the concrete. And by spreading the word, each idea moves a little closer to becoming a reality. What happens when you give a powerful idea a megaphone? Thriving Cultures works to connect some of the most compelling visions to an amplifier. The activists, influencers, and policymakers who can rally support behind a big idea. They generate the kind of momentum that people can't ignore and move ideas from artistic practice to policy. And you never know, maybe the next big dream you see come true will be what sparks your creativity and inspires you to make change in your community. And when that happens, Thriving Cultures will be ready to listen. Imagine something better. Imagine with us.
Thank you, Tom, for showing that. Oh my God, it's like the first time that we share it with a group of people. So thank you so much for sticking around and watching this video. I just want to call out the fact that we did partner, again, that same approach of working with artists that are connected to the work, which is part of this strategy slide that I'm going to be sharing right now. Sorry for moving back and forth, but we can stay here with the strategy side. I'd just say the fact that at Pollen, we ask big questions every day, but two of them that are always very important to the work that we do is what story are we going to tell and how are we going to tell it? So what story? Everything is a story. But what's important is identifying the ones that you can talk about authentically and the ones that with people at the center. Relating back to this animation video that we just shared with you, we really work closely with the Cerno Foundation to identify with their grants who has already been receiving support from the Cerno Foundation and how we can tell that story. With Deanna's likeness in this piece, we really focus on reimagining the incarceration system in the United States. Then once you highlight that story, let's find a storyteller. Let's find an artist that can really help convey that work. And as we know, we are fortunate to work in a region that is brimming with a creative talent in various ways: photographers, illustrators, copywriters, you name it. If you don't have the voices on staff to do it, which sometimes might be the case, there are freelancers and organizations like Pollen who can help. And I can't stress this enough. If anybody ever has a question, please feel free to reach out. But finding talent and respecting the artist's work is crucial. And you do that by paying and showing up and really asking yourselves, like, if I want to build this relationship with the creative community, I am going to support them, whether you do that by hiring them for a specific project, by going to their shop and purchasing an art piece from them. There are various ways to start building those connections and understanding that a lot of artists do care and are a part and involved with the different topics that pertain to your organization. So I'll just leave the strategies approach on this end that pertains to the animation video that we just saw, and also to the work that we do at Pollen, and really impacts my role at Pollen as art director and talent director. So from here, I'll move us into our next slide, where Jerome is going to share a few things for strategies continued.
A few tactical things here to keep in mind, a couple that are more conceptual at the end of the list. First, authenticity of voice. If you have capacity on staff to do storytelling, particular written storytelling, you are one step ahead because you've got someone who knows your work, knows how to speak about it authentically, has lived it, and understands your messaging. If you've got that on staff and you've got the capacity to have that person focus on messaging, you're in great shape. But if not, you have to hire someone to write your story, to tell your story in the written context. One key thing to think about: get someone who's connected to the issue. The example I give all the time of what not to do is the New York Times diner story. This is sort of a whole genre of news article where a newspaper sends someone to some place in Kansas or Arkansas or something, have them go to a diner and talk to people there about their beliefs. Every time I read one of these pieces, it feels like a spaceship has landed in the diner and the alien has gotten out and is amazed by these strange people and beings that they've discovered there. I just find it to be totally gross. It's even grosser when that approach is used to report on issues around people of color or other marginalized communities. It's just bad. The best thing we do at Pollen is try to find people who have an understanding of the community or from the community, have a connection to the issue we're writing about. And if you have to pick a writer to share your story, try to find someone who has a connection that can bring that authenticity so it doesn't feel anthropological. The next piece is keep your story short if you can. All of us do really complex work, and all of our work could fill a 10,000 word article, but people have busy lives. And so the more you're able to condense that into something deeply impactful, the more likely folks will read to the end of the page. One sort of addendum to that is keep it short, but give people paths for more. So as you saw in both examples of change language earlier, we pulled a lot of information from the big passages to the small passages. But as long as there are links that people can find to dig deeper if they want to, they're in good shape. The next piece, stay on message. If you're doing narrative change work, this came up a lot in my breakout group. Changing the story of your organization takes time, so be ready for the long haul. Eventually, if you stay on message, you'll start to see the examples of how you want to talk about your work echoed back to you as other people talk about it. It won't happen at first, but if you stay connected to that message and keep at it, it will happen. And then values first. Again, as I mentioned, that's the constant. Even as your strategies change, your methods change, the platforms you use change, as long as the values stay consistent, it won't feel like a tectonic shift to folks who are consuming that message. It'll feel like a natural evolution. So these last two are a little bit bigger. One is don't be afraid to wade in. So as 2020 sort of drew to a close, there's one surprise that I remember it had in store still. I was surprised to see a presidential candidate talking openly about white supremacy and the urgent need for racial equity, but that's where we are. And it reminded me that sometimes it can be scary to adopt a responsive approach to communications when the big topics of the moment are so heavy, but there are rewards for that. I worked at big national nonprofits that were ostensibly all about equity and justice, but they were afraid to wade into issues of social justice. It was very bizarre. And other orgs are wondering, Like, what does all of this have to do with what we do? There's no definitive or blanket answer to that, other than to say there's no pathway toward a livable collective future that isn't affected or held hostage by issues of race and white supremacy. So if you want to find the connections in your issue area, they're there to be found if you look. Don't be afraid to wade in if you find them. And then tip imagination to action. Don't be afraid to tell your networks what to do. It works. We do it in fundraising all the time. We make the ask. In communications, we got to do the same thing. Give people tangible actions they can take. And that should be a component in most communications these days. Where should they show up? Who should they pass the message on to? What online gathering should they sign up for? And yeah, where should they donate? When you get people energized by a well-chosen and well-told story, give them some place to direct that energy that you've generated, and then everyone wins. So that is about the end of what we've got. We only have a couple minutes left. If there are questions, maybe we can answer one or two. But the key takeaway here is to be brave. There's rewards for imagination, for commitment to bravery, for having a message that resonates with today and doesn't feel stuck in the past. And thanks all for being here. So we are going to, oh, go ahead.
Oh, this is Moni. Hey.
So we've got a couple minutes for questions. I'm going to scan the chat to see if anything pops in.
And as Jamie highlighted in it, if anybody has a question and is not able to get to it now, feel free to reach out to us. Our emails are here in the chat. So again, don't hesitate to reach out to us. It means a lot that you showed up for our presentation, and I hope that you leave from it inspired and excited. And Junie says hi. You can't do that one at a big presentation in person.